This is part 2 of our session on Martin Buber, Zionism, and the New Perspectives of Paul. I'm going to introduce a little bit on this section Edward Said because he's a very important thinker in this context. But let me just briefly review where we were in the first presentation. There's the standard or the establishment position in terms of reading Paul, in which you have gospel, in which you have law, you have liberty, you have bondage, you have election, and then you have works. And it's by faith in the grace of God, because the nature of the law is oppressive, that we, out of this comes essentially the justification by grace through faith. And to the degree we accept Christ's finished work on the cross, we are accepted by God through Christ. This is the standard position in terms of how Paul is read in Galatians and Romans. Out of that, there has come a critique of that standard or traditional perspective on reading Paul in Galatians, Romans, and other books, and this is what's called the New Perspectives of Paul. As I mentioned the last time, there are two streams that go to that. There's the Christopher Stendhal and Paul Van Buren tradition, which is decidedly much more engaged with the issue of the Jews, Judaism, and the contemporary issue of Israel. And then there is the tradition of Sanders and Dunn and N.T. Wright. Now, what I'd like to briefly touch on here, first of all, in this discussion that goes on, is that there's a certain group of people who are invisible in this context. In the late 1970s, as I mentioned last time, Sanders' first work was published, as was Christopher Stendhal's. Another important work was published in the late 1970s by Edward Said. It's called Orientalism. And Orientalism revolutionized the whole study of the West versus the Middle East and how the West tends to see the Middle East. And if I can just pull back a bit here in terms of New Perspectives of Paul, when they approach the Bible, it's mostly a study of Paul and his interaction with the Jews, and how is the emerging Christianity to make sense of the Judaism from which it the womb that it came from. Do we see Christianity as replacing Judaism, superseding Judaism? What place is there for the Jews and Judaism with the coming of Christ and the birth of the church? There's two approaches to that. One is you stay in the text and you just study Paul's revisionist think and his theology in regard to the Jews as a result of the coming of Christ and the theology that emerges for the church. The other is to say, okay, there is that text, but what does it mean for a contemporary state of Jews, Judaism in Israel, particularly in post-Holocaust? And a lot of important theology is being done post-World War II Holocaust. But interestingly enough, both in the text of the New Testament and then often where people like Stendhal, Van Buren, and the other New Perspectives of Paul from Sanders and Dunn and Wright, they totally ignore the Palestinians. You don't see the Palestinians in the New Testament. And a lot of the thinking in terms of New Perspectives of Paul ignores the Palestinians. Now, Edward Said, in his brilliant work in the 1970s, there's a couple of arguments he makes there, and this has to be brought into bear in the New Perspectives of Paul for the simple reason that the discussion be very narrowed to the Jewish, Judaism, Israel, Christians' response to it, and that's all there is, as if that's all that's going on in the modern world. In fact, obviously, within the Middle East and Palestine and then Israel, there was the lived reality of Palestinian Muslims, Palestinian Christians who held land there for thousands of years. So when you get the discussion of the New Perspectives of Paul reduced just to theological, exegetical issues, or what that means for the state of Israel today, the reality of the context of the Palestinians in that area, West Bank, Gaza, the refugee camps, is simply ignored. So when we begin to look at this question in a much bigger context, bringing in the work of Edward Said, although not a biblical critic, he's one of the finest literary critics of the 20th century, particularly in the areas of comparative literature, this widens out the framework of discussion in terms of the Jews, Christianity, Palestinians, both Muslims and Christians, within which a meaningful discussion has to take place, because that's the lived reality of most people today in that area. So to exclude them is to feed into a bit of Orientalist discourse. We just ignore these people, and in doing so, they'll go away, or we oppress those people. And so When we think of Buber, Zionism, New Perspectives of Paul, it's absolutely essential that the work of Edward Said and Palestinian thinkers, both Muslim and Christian, are brought into this discourse. I'd like to move the discussion a little bit in terms of New Perspectives of Paul in a few different directions here. One is the West Coast. Three important thinkers emerged when I was going at University of British Columbia and at Vancouver School of Theology and Regent College, for that matter. One was Lloyd Gaston's important work on Paul and the Torah. Lloyd Gaston was doing some very interesting work in that he was drawing together, on the one hand, the New Perspectives of Paul, of Sanders in his work on covenant nomism, but he was also drawing deeply from the work of Paul Van Buren. Lloyd Gaston, like Paul Van Buren, both did their studies with Karl Barth in Basel. And one of the most interesting discussions amongst many these days is what was Barth, both Karl Barth and his son Marcus Barth's view in terms of the relationship of the Jews to Christians after the coming of Christ. Did God's call, election with the Jews continue? And if so, what did that look like in terms of the contemporary state of Israel? Because inevitably we have to move this discussions of Galatians and Romans into contemporary reality, or it remains a museum piece, an archaeological site, a place for academics and scholars, but largely irrelevant to the tragedy and the clashes between different cultures in the Middle East at the present time. So in one sense, the genius of the Van Burens and the Christer Stendals is they're willing to move this discussion into the contemporary situations. The downside of their discussion is that they tend to favor or valorize the Jews in terms of the relationship to the Palestinians. Lloyd Gaston's argument is essentially that there's a difference between Christian theology and biblical theology. Christian theology post-Christ has constantly slipped into anti-Semitic ways of seeing things. And so the notion of replacement theology, supercessionism, leads to a triumphalism, which leads to anti-Semitism. And so we have to set biblical theology or Pauline theology against Christian theology. And he attempts to rescue, this is Lloyd Gaston, he attempts to rescue Pauline theology from critiques of supersessionism, triumphalism, and then what follows is often anti-Semitism. And of course, in the history of Christianity, post-first century, there is this tendency in Christian theology, thinking within the church, towards a certain anti-Semitic tendency. And there's certain legitimacy in what Lloyd Gaston has argued, not only in Paul and Torah, but in some of his other works. The interesting thing, again, with Lloyd Gaston is he draws from works like Van Buren and Stendhal. Again, you get this support of the state of Israel. And so what happens is when Paul comes along, his critique of the law is largely to disassociate himself from the Jewish tradition as a means of evangelizing the Gentile or classical world. He wasn't really against the law. It was more a choice, a practical, prudential choice he made so he could identify with a whole other audience in which he was trying to evangelize in the role of Christ in the classical world. But Gaston would argue, following to some degree from Van Buren and Stendhal, the calling of the Jews remained. The covenant was there, the law was a good, and that also the Jewish people still remain central to God's heart. Always the question is, though, when this is done in the first century, what does it mean for post-Holocaust thinking? The second thinker, who actually I was his TA at UBC, wrote a work called Christian Anti-Semitism, A History of Hate. Bill Nichols, he started the Religious Studies Department at University of British Columbia, and he was very close friends with Lloyd Gaston. So at the Vancouver School of Theology, Religious Studies at University of British Columbia. What Bill did, he tracked very, very closely, essentially, the history of Christianity, which could be equated with a history of hate, and the anti-Semitism that comes from that. Bill's argument is similar to Lloyd Gaston's. As soon as you get the coming to be of Christianity, Christianity sees in Christ the fulfillment of Judaism. Christianity replaces Judaism, it supersedes it, and what follows from that is a triumphalism that leads to anti-Semitism. And so the task then becomes, what is to be the relationship of Christianity to Judaism if replacement theology leads to anti-Semitism? Much of Bill's work argues at the heart of Christianity is this anti-Semitism, which finally flowers in the Holocaust of World War II, and the need to get back to a Christian understanding of Judaism, in which he would argue, like Gaston, like Van Buren, like Christopher Stendhal, that the Jews still remain central to God. Now, the dilemma with these perspectives is, when you begin to honor the Jewish perspective in relationship to a Christian tradition of anti-Semitism, is that you begin to get an idealizing of Jews, Judaism, and the state of Israel, so you can't critique it. And if you do, then people are called anti-Semitic in that sense. So there is this one story coming out of the West Coast, coming from Bill Nichols, Lloyd Gaskin, drawing from a certain wing of New Perspectives of Paul. The other person would be Don Lewis, who teaches at Regent College. He's done a very fine work, came out a few years ago, which in one sense is an indirect critique of Bill Nichols. And he looks at the origins of Christian Zionism, particularly Shaftesbury, and then really up to the Balfour Declaration in 1917. And he argues that the evangelical tradition is primarily Philo-Semitic. And so unlike Bill Nichols, who argues the Christian tradition tends to be anti-Semitic, and Christians post-World War II have to be much more sensitive to the Jewish plight and situation, Don Lewis's argument is, in fact, that it is the evangelical tradition, particularly the Reformed tradition emerging in the 16th century, that turned back to the Old Testament or the Hebrew canon and saw there the situation of God choosing the Jewish people, the election, the law, the land, all of these things, and the Jews were not in their land anymore. And so by the 16th century up to the 19th century, there finally emerged by the 19th century this coming to be of Shaftesbury and the German pietist tradition that were very Philo-Semitic. And so the evangelical tradition, Don Lewis is going to argue very clearly, is Philo-Semitic, or what we call teachings of esteem versus teachings of contempt. And so when we think of Christian Zionism today, of the Jerry Falwell, John Hagee, Christians United for Israel, the temptation is to argue that, in fact, this is something new. But in fact, Don Lewis has clearly highlighted from the 16th century, there are substantive thinkers and activists which are at the forefront of the teachings of esteem, Philo-Semitism, and played a significant role in the terms of assisting the Jews in the return to their homeland, which was Palestine at the time. So what we have then is a couple of traditions, and when we think of Christopher Stendhal, Van Buren, Gaston, Nichols, which tend to be pro-state Israel, as if this is something new. In fact, as Don Lewis has pointed out, the evangelical tradition was Philo-Semitic long before New Perspectives of Paul. In fact, their reading Perspectives of Paul antedates significantly the work of Christopher Stendhal, Van Buren, Lloyd Gaskin, and Nichols. So they can't be accused of being anti-Semitic. In fact, it is the evangelical Reformed tradition from a certain perspective that led to the Balfour Declaration 1917, that led to the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. Now the point here, I'm going to move on to Martin Buber, because this is significant. The tendency then to think is, once we move from a supersessionist replacement position that is seen as triumphalistic and then anti-Semitic, to a position of Philo-Semitic or teachings of esteem, do we necessarily have to then uncritically accept the Jews' return to their homeland, the founding of the State of Israel, and the impact of all of that on the Palestinians in the area? This is where Martin Buber is very significant. Martin Buber was very involved with the first Zionist conference in 1897. He was very connected to Theodor Herzl, and there was a whole movement late 19th century. And in fact, the Christian Zionism that Don Lewis talks about, that emerges in the 16th century, accelerates in the 19th, was a back, really, in many ways, of the birth of Jewish Zionism. So it's Christian Zionism for 300-400 years that births, in many ways, the renewal or renaissance of Jewish Zionism. And so it was Christians, William Heckler amongst many others, who came to Theodor Herzl, the late 19th century, and said, listen, there's a whole story amongst your people. Your people are the chosen by God, and we want to be part of renewing you as a people and taking you back to your homeland, not just reviving Judaism, but reviving the relationship of Jews, Judaism, and State of Israel. So Martin Buber was very connected to Theodor Herzl in this revival in his early years of Jewish nationalism and the First Zionist Conference. Now, what interesting thing happens here is Buber, like Herzl and many Christians, will argue against a replacement supersessionist theology, but there's two directions the Jewish and Christian community move, particularly the Philo-Semitic. One moves in the direction the Jews are God's chosen people. Let's assist in the return to the homeland, and we don't critique the state of Israel because that is part of the fulfillment of God's calling. The other position which you can take from there, and that's the position tends to be of Herzl, Jabotinsky, David Ben-Gurion, who's the first prime minister, a strong nationalist perspective. The other from Martin Buber, who saw where this was going after the first Zionist conference in 1897, argued for a cultural Zionism, not a political Zionism. Political Zionism of Herzl, Jabotinsky, and Ben-Gurion was a secular Zionism, suspicious of the religious element, but very political and nationalist, and that the Jewish people had a right to return to their land, to form a state, and then to defend themselves against what they perceived as terrorists, which is one way of understanding Edward Said's Orientalism. You see these people in a negative way. We idealize the Jews, we demonize the opponents, and that's part of an Orientalist Western thesis of how we see the Middle East. Now, Martin Buber took the position, cultural Zionism is about Jewish language, history, texts, rituals, but be very, very careful of reducing the prophetic Jewish tradition to an eschatological position. The prophetic tradition for Buber was the Jews were meant to be above all a people concerned with justice and peace, not only for their own people, but for the outsider, for the foreigner, in this case obviously the Palestinians, what was become the West Bank and Gaza. And so his whole understanding of what it meant to be Jewish was both prophetic and Zionist, but understood quite differently the nationalist Zionist. It was prophetic Zionism. And this story is often quite forgotten by the Christian Zionists who uncritically support the state of Israel as if that is the only Jewish response or read of the Bible. There's this whole other tradition of what we call prophetic Zionism versus nationalist Zionism, which is very critical of the state of Israel when it itself does not mirror, embody, and reflect a vision of peace and justice for Jews within the Jewish community and for Jews as they relate to other people. So when we think of Martin Buber and his understanding, people can argue, okay, supersessionism, replacement theology is a problem. And if you want to go down that road, you can say yes, but be wary of going down that road if it leads to nationalist Zionism and the oppression of the Palestinians and other peoples. You can accept, on one hand, that supersessionism replacement, but if you approach it from a Buberian perspective, it's, okay, the call of the Jews remains, land is important, but land is always secondary to ethical vision. And when people use land as an absolute and subordinate the ethical, the land itself becomes an idol, and nationalism itself becomes a form of idolatry. And this is what Buber was very, very critical in turning the penultimate into the ultimate, and then you end up defending a form of crude nationalism, which many of the prophets of the Hebrew canon constantly critiqued. I'd like to just move also, one of our great Canadians, actually Brad did his PhD on, was George Grant. And when I was at McMaster in the 1980s, George Grant was, Brad's thesis itself was on Grant and significantly Simone Weil. And Simone Weil has always been seen, even though she is a Jewess, as a bit of a pariah to the Jewish story, because one, she's quite willing to critique the violence in the Hebrew canon, quite willing to critique what she saw the Jewish position was, and increasingly so in Palestine. And one of the key Jewish faculty members of McMaster, for when I was at McMaster, the department was funded quite heavily in terms of Christian Jewish studies. A book came out called Exiles from Nowhere, the Jews and the Canadian Elite. And Mendelssohn is very critical of George Grant and the Grant family in terms of what he argues is their anti-Semitism and their triumphalism. And this is one way, of course, then of if you can dismiss the Christian tradition as being anti-Semitic and triumphalist, then Christians begin to feel terribly guilty, and almost out of default, they begin to uncritically support the state of Israel because they don't want to be accused of being anti-Semitic. And so there becomes this very difficult way of silencing opposition to the state of Israel by arguing if Christians take a position of replacement theology, supersessionism, this leads to triumphalism. Triumphalism leads to anti-Semitism. And this is what essentially Mendelssohn's argument is that you go down this path, this is where it leads in terms of Jewish diaspora, this is what it leads in terms of the state of Israel, and George Grant is a part of that legacy and history. My question is it possible, and certainly New Perspectives of Paul, is it possible to take a position of replacement theology, supersessionism, without being triumphalistic and anti-Semitic? This is a question that has to be asked. You get someone like an N.T. Wright, for example, is going to argue from this perspective, and that somehow Christianity in Christ has replaced Judaism, but does that necessarily, can that be equated with triumphalism or anti-Semitism? These are important questions to ask. Now, within the evangelical tradition, as I mentioned earlier, there is this position that Don Lewis articulates insightfully in his book on the origins of Christian Zionism, that evangelicals equal Philo-Semitism and support of Israel. Now, there's a variety of Christian evangelicals today which will argue that is not necessarily the case. And so a year ago we had up at University of the Fraser College Gary Berg, who came from Wheaton College, and he's done an amazing amount of work in terms of this question itself, and pointing out that the evangelical tradition need not, in its story, it can be Philo-Semitic, that doesn't mean it's pro-Israeli. And so there's a lot of important distinctions that have to be made in terms of this discussion. Always hovering behind us, of course, is the Holocaust and the history of Christian anti-Semitism. So it has to be handled very delicately, because often any critique of any position of supersessionism or support of the state of Israel is often equated with anti-Semitism. No one wants to be anti-Semitic, so you avoid supersessionism, critiquing the state of Israel, which then of course silences people in terms of critiquing this. This is where Martin Buber is so important, because here's someone coming from a Jewish background, and he's quite willing to critique the state of Israel as a Jew in terms of its treatment of Jews. Certainly willing to critique the nationalist tradition that you get from Herzl, Jabotinsky, Ben-Gurion, all those follow that hawkish tradition right up to Netanyahu. And so when we think of Israel, the question is, well, whose understanding of Israel? Is it going to be the prophetic Zionism, or is it going to be nationalist Zionism? And often Christian traditions, in following the Philo-Semitic teachings of esteem, have slipped too quickly into supporting a form of nationalist Zionism rather than prophetic Zionism. And this has then rendered them absolutely impotent in critiquing the terrible injustices. And that story, that whole narrative for most Christian Zionists, they're not even aware of that tradition of Martin Buber and Judah Magnus and many Jewish peace activists for today. So people like Gary Berg, Stephen Sizer's work from low church Anglican perspective, evangelicals, critiquing that particular notion that many evangelicals have attached themselves to, is an uncritical support of the state of Israel. This gives an alternate view from within the evangelical tradition. Now, I just want to also mention there are many Jewish dissidents today that come out of the Buber tradition. From a historical perspective, we have Finkelstein and Papa, who are arguing you can't sanitize Jewish history pre-48 and post-48 as if you had the evil Muslims, evil Palestinians, and the persecuted Jews. In fact, there was already a plan in place pre-1948 to, in many ways, commit what Finkelstein and Papa will argue is a form of ethnic genocide against the Palestinians. In terms of North America, Mark Braverman, Mark Ellis, two very important Jews who, like Buber, have dared to interrogate their own heritage and have been marginalized for doing so. For when Jews do it, they're called Jew haters. When people who are not Jews do it, they're called anti-Semitic. And that sort of circular argument silences a prophetic vision in terms of prophet as the ethical vision of justice and peace. There's also coming out from obviously the Palestinian perspective, both Muslim and Christian. Sabeel would probably be the most important Palestinian Christian organization. Its origins are Anglican, but there's Lutherans very involved. There's evangelical Palestinians involved with this, that allow the voice of the Palestinians, and of course this is largely called liberation theology, to be heard. But often what happens is Sabeel gets caricatured by Christian Zionists and then by Jewish Zionists as terrorists or part of Hamas or Al-Fatah, which of course it's not. But that allows people to, in a very simplistic way, then dismiss the Palestinian liberation theologians. So two questions by way of ending we need to think of in terms of the new perspectives of Paul, Zionism, and Martin Buber. One is, if we take the position that, okay, supersessionism, replacement, is something that we want to question for the sake of argument, that God still holds the Jewish people, Judaism, Israel, as the apple of his eye. What then should Israel look like? Okay, is it just to be a form of aggressive, hawkish nationalism in which the Palestinians are oppressed, which often what happens in terms of right-wing Jewish Zionism or secular Zionism versus the orthodox form of Zionism, which is very suspicious of that? Or from the Buberian tradition, is there in fact a form of recognizing God still holds the Jewish people as sacred, land is important to them, but land and responsibility and ethical concerns are built into that. And so that prophetic vision has great compassion and generosity towards the Palestinians and tries to think through how a justice can emerge in something like that. The other question, which is important to think through then, is can we discuss legitimately replacement, supersessionist theology without it being equated with triumphalism and anti-Semitism? And that's what's often thrown in very, very quickly, is that and this is what to some degree you're going to get from people like the Van Burens and the Christer Stendells, particularly Van Buren, who did all this amazing work on Christian-Jewish dialogue. But what often happens in something like that is the Van Buren people slip into a very uncritical support of the state of Israel. And in the name of dialogue, you don't discuss the oppression that's going on in terms of the Palestinians. And so Martin Buber, Edward Said needs to be brought into this discussion, because when we unpack Orientalism within new perspectives of Paul, which it often isn't, and then look at this in terms of variations of Christian Zionism and Jewish Zionism, it opens up a much bigger world that is often not discussed. And those who excessively focus on new perspectives of Paul, just the Sanders done right position, ignore the more politicized views, and certainly the older evangelical tradition, which antedates almost in one sense the Stendhal Van Buren, which again leads to an uncritical support of the state of Israel. It's highly problematic. So who are the alternate voices in the narrative? Well, there's the Buber tradition, which is important. There's the ongoing prophetic Jews in Israel. There's alternate Christian evangelicals like Gary Berg and Sizer. There's Palestinian thinkers on this issue. And so there's a variety of people that can offer us an alternate perspective on an uncritical approach to Jewish and Christian Zionism that still comes from within the biblical text, honors the Palestinian voice, honors a Jewish prophetic tradition, and is deeply evangelical also.